Hello, and welcome to Keep Left. I'm John O'Connor. I'm an attorney. I'm not your attorney. And I'm the host of this podcast and YouTube channel where I'm hoping to bring you a perspective about current events, things I think you should know about from a lefty perspective. My hope with this channel is to try to do my best to find common cause amongst all the different political affiliations that you would describe as left of center, in the hopes that by exploring different points of view as well and trying to find some common ground, we can together deal with the threats to our rights and how the future of the world and our countries are going to pan out together as a group. Because I do believe that one of the ways that right-wing movements succeed is when the left and the middle don't come together to try to stop them. So hopefully you'll join with me and we talk about various things. This is a very low-key affair. Obviously, hopefully as I go through this, I'll be able to do a little bit more polished thing, but I did want to get this going because the first topic we're going to talk about is, I think, very pressing, and I think it's part of a movement that is really threatening to sort of swamp Anglo-American culture in ways that are just very unfortunate. And what I'm talking about right now is something called the Cass Review. The Cass Review is a review commissioned by the current conservative government in Britain to review how gender identity services for children and young people were being provided by the NHS. And it's called the Cass Review because it's led by a person named Dr. Cass, who we'll talk about very briefly. And before we really dive in, I just want to say I'm not an expert in endocrinology. I'm not an expert in pediatric medicine. As I said, I'm a lawyer, but one of the things I've been trained to do from college is how to dig into and dissect what things are saying, what they mean to be saying, and what's really going on. And I think as you'll go through this review with me, you will see some of the ways in which how it's framed, how it approaches things just on its own terms are incredibly troubling. I will point out here and there places where what they're saying is completely baseless or is taking things out of context. And I will post in the notes places you can go to get further in-depth reviews, including other podcasts and other experts, into just how unscientific the supposed independent scientific review of transgender treatment really is. And the reason I want to really talk about it, and we'll get into this as we go along, is that people who identify as transgender have been a target of so many different parties and movements and churches and authoritarian regimes, and it is very much the thin edge of the wedge as part of a means of controlling more and more of our individual lives and bodies. This is exactly the transgender, the anti-transgender movement, the transphobic movement is really aligned very much, at least not as in a conspiracy sort of way, but in an ideological kind of way, with the movements to control women's bodies in terms of abortion, to force people into marriages that they don't want to be part of, to have children they don't want to have, and so forth, as a way of trying to push traditional means of religion, of culture, and of power dynamics. And for further reading, and I'll put this again in the quotes, there's a new book by Judith Butler called Who's Afraid of Gender, where they tackle the movement against the so-called gender ideology, which is something you'll see. You'll see transgender ideology, you'll see gender ideology, this idea that all of these things that are coming up are really just new over the last 5 or 10 years, or exploding over the last 5 or 10 years, when in reality, transgender people have always existed. As long as there have been people, there have been transgender people. As long as there's been an idea of gender, there have been transgender people. And this is nothing new under the sun, despite the hyperbolic tenor of what you'll see often in these things. So the Cass Review was commissioned by the Tory government to provide an independent review into the system. There's a lot about it. So it's over 300 pages long, a lot of his appendices. I'm not going to go through it page by page, but I have gone through and highlighted specific portions to try to explain both what's going on, what it means, and how it uses language also to appear to be making erudite, evidence-based arguments when they're really not, and also to get into what it is that they're really, really saying. And so let's begin on the CAS review. As you can see, it independent review of gender identity services for children and young people. In the introduction section, they talk about different factors that are at play here. And one thing I do want to say about the CAS review is, and this actually gets overlooked by a lot of people who are opposed to transgender rights or are transphobic, there's a lot in here that is actually good for transgender and non-binary people. There is a thread through this of compassion and acknowledgement of their existence. And that totally gets overlooked by people who are using it to claim that any sort of medical support of transgender children or young adults is somehow some kind of abuse situation. That is literally nothing that is said about this review. In fact, I will summarize sort of the basic gist of the report, which is that at the end of the day, the CAS review concludes that the evidence supporting early medical intervention for children, adolescents who are experiencing some sort of level of a belief that they are transgender, the science is unclear whether that's supportive or not, and that therefore caution should be used when prescribing those sorts of things. That is what it says. Period. That is it's the whole gist. More research should be done, and more caution should be exercised. The way it goes about that, however, really plays into a lot of tropes that are transphobic. It plays into a lot of ways in which it ignores vast quantities of evidence to the contrary, and more importantly, I think it ignores it. It is a pro-traditionalist screed. And as we go through, we'll sort of see how that means. So, for example, right off the bat, here is this highlighted section. Generalizations about children and young people questioning their gender identity or experiencing gender dysphoria are unhelpful. People are individuals. Absolutely perfect. Like that is, I think, very few people who are of good faith would disagree with that. However, almost it's 2 paragraphs below that, the extra highlighted section, whilst some young people may feel an urgency to transition, young adults looking back at their younger selves would often advise slowing down. There is no source for that anywhere. That is such a generalization. Would often advise slowing down. Often? What does often mean? How is that a number? How do you quantify that? And, in some ways it's a tautology. It means nothing in that. I think if I look back at myself as a younger person, I might have said, hey, whoa, slow down. Why are you in such a rush? I think we all sometimes think about that about our younger selves. But I wouldn't presume to say that about other people necessarily. And to sort of use that as a means of saying, let's second guess what other people are going to do with their own medicines is really interesting. And then for some, the best outcome will be transition, whereas others may resolve their distress in other ways. Some may transition and then detransition, retransition, and or experience regret. The NHS needs to care for all those seeking support. And again, for some is doing a lot of work here and throughout this entire review. There is some quantification we'll get into later on, but as sort of an interesting sort of overview of where they're going, for some doesn't mean anything. Yes, sure, if it's more than one person, that is some people, but it's not necessarily a lot of people. There remains diversity of opinion as to how best to treat these children and young people. This is true. There are absolutely churches and groups out there who think that the best way to treat them is to put them into conversion therapy. That doesn't mean they're correct. The evidence is weak, and clinicians have told us they are unable to determine with any certainty which children and young people will go on to have an enduring trans identity. The implication of that is, what if they detransition? What if they change their minds later on? And as we'll see, that is a vanishingly small number of people who actually detransition. Once people have gone through any sort of process to get medical interventions, the number of people who actually change their mind or quote unquote regret what they've done is incredibly small. Also, the evidence isn't weak, but again, other people can speak to that more than I will. I will just summarize what's going on. A failure to consider or debate the underlying reasons for the change in the patient population has led to people taking different positions about how to respond to the children and young people at the center of the debate. I think a lot of that is because, as we've seen in America and in Britain and a lot of around the places, most people who are taking a slow down approach on these things aren't necessarily saying, hey, be careful, these things are unproven. They're often denying that transgender people exist as transgender people, that it's a phase, that it's men pretending to be women or women pretending to be men, and that they can never transition, that somehow gender is immutable. And let's be fair, I wouldn't want to sit down and have a conversation with someone who was opposed to my existence as a person. Why should I? I don't think it's a good faith argument to be making. Down below, they will talk about the exponential change in referrals over a particularly short 5-year time frame. Let's stick a pin in that, because exponential change in referrals comes up a lot. And it's unclear if there actually has been an exponential change. And yet, the review pins so much on this change to say that something is going on other than acceptance, other than a legitimate increase in the number of people willing to buck peer pressure and the pressure of the world and come out as transgender. One of the subtexts of a lot of this is that we can't trust people to tell us they are transgender. We cannot trust children. We cannot trust young adults. We cannot trust adolescents because something is influencing them or they are mentally ill. And I am not exaggerating when I say that the review very heavily implies that we cannot trust it when people say that they are transgender. There has been a substantial increase in rates of mental health problems in children and adolescents across the UK over the past decade, with increased anxiety and depression being most evident in teenage girls. Fair. This is true. I think we all accept that over the last decade, mental health has been a problem for many people, myself included. The pandemic took its toll, and everything that's been happening over the last 10 years has been terrible. Research suggests gender expression is likely determined by a variable mix of factors such as biological predisposition, early childhood experiences, sexuality, and expectations of puberty. For some, mental health difficulties are hard to disentangle. The impact of a variety of contemporary societal influences and stressors, including online experience, remains unclear. Peer influence is also very powerful during adolescence, as are different generational perspectives. Those are a bunch of sentences that individually are probably true and unarguable. It can be hard to disentangle various mental health struggles. If you're depressed and bipolar, if you're depressed and autistic, if you're depressed and have anxiety or anxiety and autism, how do you treat one? How do you treat multiple things? If you are seeking some kind of medical help, I think more and more doctors are realizing that you can't just treat bodies, you also have to treat minds at the same time. And I don't think that's necessarily incorrect. The impact of a variety of contemporary societal influences and stressors remains unclear. Absolutely. How is our internet age affecting us? Peer influence is also powerful during adolescence. Again, I don't think that's necessarily untrue. And yet, putting these all in the same paragraph seems to suggest that gender expression is influenced by these things, and that therefore gender expression is false. There's some sort of false consciousness, if I can borrow a phrase. There's some kind of illegitimacy to someone's gender expression because somehow the societal impulses means that they're fake. I'm petty. I just like to notice that there's an extra period where there shouldn't be in this very professional and report that the British public paid millions of pounds for. Paragraph 66, the majority of young people, a medical pathway may not be the best way to achieve this. May, again, doing a lot of work there. And probably true. Yeah, I don't think a majority of young people are trans. So therefore, a medical pathway may not be the best way to achieve anything. For those young people for whom a medical pathway is clinically indicated, it is not enough to provide this without addressing wider mental health and or psychologically challenging problems such as family breakdown, barriers to participation in school life or social activities, bullying, and minority stress. That is true. I think. I think every child probably needs some sort of assistance from a psychologist or psychiatrist at a certain point. I see nothing wrong with that. But again, this is in the context of delegitimizing trans people. There are different views on the benefits versus the harms of early social transition. Yes, some parents, some teachers, some adults don't like it. Some consider that it may improve mental health for children experiencing gender-related distress, while others consider it makes it more likely that a child's gender dysphoria, which might have resolved at puberty, has an altered trajectory, potentially culminating in lifelong medical intervention. Trajectory is such an interesting word, because although it never comes out and says it exactly, what does it mean to have a different gender trajectory? What does it mean to have your altered trajectory? And what's bad about that? More importantly, if I realize based on my experiences that I am not the gender I was assigned at birth, why is that a bad thing? If I have an experience, whatever that experience is, if I go out bungee jumping and I realize as soon as that cord brings me back, oh my goodness, I'm actually a female, or I'm not male, I'm something else. How is that bad? If there was some study that showed that 5% of people who bungee jumped were turned out to be non-gender, would you ban bungee jumping? I don't think so, but yet somehow that's a bad thing. 76, the systemic review showed no clear evidence that social transition in childhood has any positive or negative mental health outcomes, and relatively weak evidence for any effect in adolescence. We should talk a little bit about the systemic review. The report commissioned York University to do a review of the literature that was out there. They did this by having various people look at the reports from all around the world and decide which ones were reliable. Only they don't use the word reliable. They use the word quality. Was it good quality, bad quality, or high quality? And the problem with that, of course, is that they changed the system they were using halfway through without ever explaining why. The implication is that they didn't like the results they were getting. Maybe, maybe not. But the review that they did wind up using talked about in terms of certainty, whether the report was high degree of certainty, middle degree of certainty, or low degree of certainty. Which makes sense. If you're looking at various sorts of studies, a double-blind study will have more certainty. But there are instances in which you can't use double-blind systems. And now a double-blind system is sort of when you are, say, testing out whether a particular drug works or not. So you will have, for example, if you're doing a migraine medication, you will get 100 people who have migraines on a regular basis. You divide them up in half randomly. Theoretically, you have a good cross-section of different people, ages, genders, races, what have you. and you give half of them randomly placebos, and you give half of them the drug you're testing, and you see what happens. And you don't know who got what. It's all sort of designed. They don't know which one they got. And so it is that double blind. And the idea is that you get the most certain tests, the most reliable outcome of numbers from that. The problem is you can't do that with all tests. It could be unethical. It could be. You wouldn't say some of you. We're going to bring out together 100 people who've broken their legs, and we're only going to put 50 of you in cast, and the rest we're just going to have you wander around on your broken legs and see who does better. There's no point in something like that, right? There's no point in giving people, 100 people, give 50 of them placebos and the other 50% puberty blockers, because you know what's going to happen. Some people are going to go through puberty, some people aren't. Sugar pills aren't going to stop you from going through puberty. And so does it make it more difficult to come up with a test for how they might impact people? Absolutely. That doesn't mean that those tests aren't worth something. It just means that those tests are less certain than if you were able to do a double-blind test. And yet, this review calls those tests that are non-double-blind low quality instead of less certain or medium certainty. And they discard those low quality tests. And it's a sort of, and again, there are other people who can speak more to the science of it. But as someone who appreciates language, this sort of double bluff of changing the test midstream and then changing the language used, because quality and certainty, they're the same things. Therefore, of course, people agree you should get rid of low quality tests. Why would you want that as part of your study? But low certainty tests, there is some value to them still. Middle certainty tests, yes, tests that don't have double-blind testing as part of it, have value and can be influential and can be useful. Yet this review discards those completely. Over and over again. In fact, in the bibliography, there were about 92 tests, and they got rid of about 90 of them. Moving along. 78. Therefore, sex rearing seems to have some influence on eventual gender outcome, and it is possible that social transition in childhood may change, again, the trajectory of gender identity development for children with early gender incongruence. Again, this sort of hand-wringing over trajectory. The clinician should help families to recognize normal developmental variation in gender role behavior and expression. Normal? What is a normal developmental variation? I know some friends, when I was growing up, experimented with gender. Some didn't. What's normal? Why should any of it be normal? Let children wear what they want. Avoiding premature decisions and considering partial rather than full transitioning can be a way of ensuring flexibility and keeping options open until the developmental trajectory becomes clearer. And again, if you sort of put these paragraphs together, the implication is that sex rearing has an impact on the trajectory of your gender. Therefore, if you allow children to socially transition, which is to say, adopt a different name, go by different pronouns, whatever that is for that particular child, you've changed the trajectory of their gender identity development. But if you only do that partially, maybe they won't go on that same trajectory, whatever trajectory that was. And again, so what? Why is one better or worse than the other? It never makes it clear, except, again, this sort of predilection and preference for normality, for as things were assigned at birth. And that exists throughout this whole thing as subtext and later on text. Here they're talking about, again, one of the systemic review about puberty blockers. And There were insufficient, inconsistent evidence about the effects of puberty suppression on psychological or psychosocial well-being, cognitive development, cardiometabolic risk, or fertility. I'm not sure why we care about fertility, but sure. And again, there are studies that show that there are. In fact, there are studies from the last 2 years, but of course, the review only went up through 2022. There is no evidence that puberty blockers buy time to think, and some concern, again, some doing a lot of work here, that they may change the trajectory, that word again, of psychosexual and gender identity development. Again, that only matters if you think being transgender is bad. And that's a transphobic, by definition, a transphobic perspective to take. The percentage of people who treated with hormones who subsequently detransition remains unknown due to the lack of long-term follow-up studies, although there is a suggestion, that numbers are increasing. There's a suggestion based on nothing that I've been able to find really in the appendices or in any research. It's unclear who is suggesting that. I mean, I suppose someone on the street could have come up and said, hey, I think the number of people who are detransitioning is growing. I would imagine if the percentage is, as some American studies have shown, around 1% of people detransition, then if more people are seeking to transition and seeking help in transitioning from one gender to another, then it stands to reason that more people are going to detransition, even if it remains 1%. Although young people often express a sense of urgency in their wish to access medical treatments based on personal experience, some young adults have suggested that taking time to explore options is preferable. Again, some suggest. In the lawyer biz, we call those weasel words. Some people say this, and it may be suggested that. Lots of people may suggest many things. Some people may suggest anything. It means nothing. It lacks foundation. It lacks evidence. 144 I've included because, again, a positive thing. There should be no lower age limit for accessing help and support for care. If people are in some level of distress or trying to figure things out, there should be no lower limit for age for a person who is seeking some kind of help. And again, this sort of thing gets overlooked by people who are jumping on this and saying, therefore, this is it shows that transgender people are not existent. Again, this sort of circles back to something I said earlier. One of the major challenges for the review has been the difficulty in having open, honest debate, as people with differing views can find it uncomfortable to sit together in the same room or on the same stage. Obviously, if I was asked to sit on a stage with someone who claimed that I had no right to exist or that I was causing harm by my mere existence, I would not want to be on the same stage as them either, frankly. Now, I'm going to be fair to them for a second. Here they're talking about a confounding factor, which is a scientific term for there is something in the system in what we're testing that makes it more difficult to sort of pull out what is the important thing. They're talking about a particular Dutch study where all the patients were seen regularly by their psychiatrist or psychologist while on puberty blockers, so it is difficult to separate the therapeutic effects of the psychological sessions from the role of puberty blockers alone. Parse that out a bit. Earlier on, they said that they think all of these children, adolescents, young adults who are experiencing a level of gender dysphoria or gender distress or what have you should have access to mental health services. Fair. But here they're saying because the Dutch service was providing mental health services to people going through puberty blockers, we can't tell if puberty blockers helped. How are you ever going to tell that? Are you going to do a double-blind study in which you give some children on puberty blockers psychological help and some not? I don't know how that works. It doesn't work. There's no way that even works. Here, it's talking about Dr. Cass was asked to chair the group as a senior clinician with no prior involvement or fixed views in this area. Now, I want to be very clear on this. Dr. Cass had fixed views in this area. And we know that because we know, based on some Freedom of Information Act stuff, that Cass met with DeSantis over a trans ban, and that, in fact, because of some Freedom of Information Act work done, the Cass was contacted by people who were working on the Don't Say Gay stuff in Florida, by people working on anti-trans stuff in Florida, who were doing the same thing in Florida, and she advised them. So you have a DeSantis advisor saying that she had no fixed view. And bear in mind, this was going on in several years ago, not just in the last year, once these reviews were underway. And so it's ridiculous to say that she had no fixed views in this area. And again, going back to a positive thing, any service design have to take account of their holistic needs, not just their gender identity. And I think most people, most children who had some sort of issue with their gender identity would agree. I think just sort of treating one thing and not looking at the person as a whole would be a bad thing. And here, of course, is the part of the review that is looking at this exponential growth over the last 5 years. And here you see it's from 2010-11 through 2021-22. And you can see this huge increase in people over the last couple of years. And it goes along. You have a huge burst in the 2013-2014, a little bit of a dip during COVID, and then a huge explosion into 5,000. Now, again, we're talking about referrals every year in Britain of about between 500 and 2,500 to 5,000 people across all of Britain. Although this is very important to all the people involved, and I don't want to diminish their importance, we're not talking about a lot of people. And we're not talking about enough people that you could say that this is somehow a cultural shift brought about by peer pressure. If I was trying to pressure a bunch of people into doing things and I got 5,000 people, I would consider that a disappointment. More people stormed the Capitol on January 6th than have been referred to transgender help in Britain. But more importantly, and something that a lot of people miss and is really difficult to see because, as you can tell, there's a footnote B down there that is in very tiny writing. And so what does that writing say? Well, if you, in fact, look at it closely, you will see that footnote is called Limitations of the Data. And it says where it gets the data from, and it spends a lot of time talking about the numbers, 5,000 referrals, et cetera, et cetera. And then that last sentence, there is a strong possibility that there was double counting. Double counting. Well, goodness, if there was double counting, my friends, instead of 5,000, how many people would there be? There'd be 2,500, which means we'd be where that turquoise line is, all things considered. Well, if we're at that turquoise line, that's not exactly an exponential growth, is it? In fact, it's a return to about the same numbers pre-pandemic. So yeah, you have a surge between 2013 and 2018. The numbers go up. And then it looks like they're leveling off a little. That's not exponential growth. That's a surge and a tapering. And yet somehow they say it's exponential. Why the report wastes time on charts which include 4 years from Europe and the USA about referrals to participating endocrine centers in those two in Europe and the USA, I'm unclear of. 4 dots or 3 dots is not enough to make any sort of conclusions about how many people we're talking about. And the fact that USA only has about 400 people and Europe has approximately 1,500 does not seem to indicate a huge increase in transgender, an explosion of transgender numbers. So there's not really an exponential growth worldwide, and there's pretty much not one in Britain. And so a lot of the impetus for some of the things that the report says later on just hold no weight. Kaltiala et al. From 2023, it's a Finnish researcher, was invited to be on the review board, advisory board for this review. There are, and I don't want to put words into these reports, so you should find them yourselves, and I'll put links down below, where allegedly Finnish trans services included very terrible mistreatment of trans children. I don't know what relationship Kaltiala has to that, but Finland is not exactly a bastion of support for transgender people by any stretch of the imagination. By the way, pop quiz, how many transgender people were on the review board for the cast review? If your answer was 0, you are correct. No trans people were on the review board. On top of everything else, the review is autistic phobic. Working out what your mind and body understanding, your integration, your gender may take longer than for non-neurotypical individuals, making neurodiverse young people potentially vulnerable. Let's think about that word for a second. Into their early 20s or longer because of their tendency to want black and white answers and their difficulty in tolerating uncertainty. Again, take a second. And if you're autistic, I apologize. If you're non-neurotypical, I apologize. Not every person who has autism or is non-neurotypical has a tendency to want black and white answers. Nor do they have difficulty tolerating uncertainty. Some do. I know some neurotypical people who have the same attributes, frankly. But be that as it may, what does vulnerable mean? Vulnerable to what? Again, the implication I can only imagine is vulnerable to abnormal transgender feelings. Again, one of the things where I kind of give them slight credit for, because you often hear about all these differences between men and women that a lot of transgender exclusive radical feminists say, and a lot of people who are opposed to any idea of an acceptance of transgender people, is that men and women are different. Well, there are very large overlaps between characteristics for men and female. Yes, there may be biological differences that may also be social in nature, that may be environmental in nature, we don't know. But there is also very large overlaps. Here's where it seems to go off the rails. Here are how sex differences are expressed. Gender role behaviors, including toy preferences, play, and physicality. Gender identity, okay. And then sexual orientation. I'm not sure how sexual orientation plays into an individual's sex preferences or sex identification, because a cisgendered person can be attracted to any gender, period, and has no impact on what their gender identity is. But this is what they're saying, and this is, of course, evidence-based. It is thought that all three of these can be influenced by biological and social factors, and it's an evolving area of research. And again, let's consider this in the background and the backdrop of the fact that they've already said that they've rejected a lot of research because it's low quality, because it wasn't well done. This is an evolving area of research. So, of course, we're not going to rely on many things here, are we? Oh, no, of course we are. Of course we are. Here we have a systemic review demonstrated that differences in toy choice are very large between those preferred by boys and those typically by girls. I haven't had a chance to track down this report. I'm very curious if this was in Western Europe versus, or America or Canada, North America, versus other countries that may not have much in the way of dolls or trucks. There's also a large overlap in gender role behaviors. The variability exists from an early age, and there's an acknowledgement that some girls exhibit behaviors that are traditionally perceived as more masculine, and some boys exhibit behaviors that are perceived as more feminine. Good for them. There's a complex interplay between testosterone levels, external genitalia, sex of rearing, and sociocultural environment, all playing a part in eventual gender identity. What's missing from there? What's missing from there? Individual brain chemistry, individual preference, individual choices, individual anything. Everything is external, right? Testosterone levels alone aside. And again, looking at how it rejected a lot of things, starting at early puberty, unused neural connections are pruned and other important connections are made stronger and faster. This is true. It used to be thought that brain maturation finished in adolescence, but it is now understood that this remodeling continues into the mid-20s. Fun fact, this study from 2016 has been, I wouldn't say discredited, but certainly extended. The reason why they said that brain maturation stopped in the mid-20s is because that's where the study stopped. Since 2016, more studies seem to show that brain maturation, such as it is, continues for the rest of your life, rest of my life. Brains continue to prune unused connections, to forge some new connections as well, although it becomes more difficult as you get older. This is, if you do any sort of research on neuroplasticity, this is what they're talking about. This idea that the brain matures is the concept that has, in fact, been rejected. And so this idea that you are somehow missing out on brain maturation if you interfere in any way with how someone's brain is functioning during those first 25 years, or that in those first 25 years they cannot make decisions, is simply incorrect, for the very simple fact that if you're waiting for your brain to be finished, quote unquote, maturing, that is never going to happen. It just isn't. Now we're blaming pornography. Several longitudinal studies have found that adolescent pornography consumption is associated with subsequent increased sexual, relational, and body satisfaction. And some researchers suggested exploration with gender questioning youth should include in consideration of their engagement with pornographic content. Why? Are you saying that someone is going to identify as transgender because they watch trans porn? And that if they just stop, they're not going to think of themselves as transgender anymore. Again, the implication being that transgender is abnormal, that transgender is something that should be treated in some way, that there is some normal out there for that matter. Again, and I highlight this as the contrast with we're getting rid of any studies that are not based on fact and reliable studies. For many centuries, transgender people have been predominantly trans females, commonly presenting in adulthood. Source. What's your source for that? What is your source? What is your source? What's the source for that? There's some discussion of brain structure, but interestingly, as they again point out, studies have shown that there's just no real difference. It's not possible to tell if a brain is male or female just by looking at the brain. Go figure. And here, the study contemplates this pushback from people who say that part of the reason why there has been an increase in the number of people identifying as transgender is because there's been more social acceptance. What's the first way they fight against that is the exponential increase in numbers in the last 5 years. Again, there may not be an exponential increase in numbers. You may just have a surge and a tailing off, and maybe a small increase from there. And if you look at left-handed studies, once upon a time, teachers thought being left-handed was wrong, and they would beat children literally. They would use rulers on people who were trying to draw with the left hand to force them to draw with the right hand. And when that was stopped, finally, there was a surge in the numbers of people who identified as left-handed, and then it tapered off. And that graph looks a lot like that transgender graph without the fake exponential up at the end, or the possibly fake exponential up. So maybe it is because of acceptance, if your first argument is incorrect. The rapid increase in numbers presenting to gender services across Western populations. Remember those graphs that showed that quote-unquote surge in referrals for endocrine services? 500 to 1,000. 1,000 to 2,000. That's not, I suppose it's rapid on one level. It's a 100% increase, but 2,000 people across Europe and, the United States, for that matter, it's not a lot. The change in prevalence from birth-registered males to birth-registered females, that could also be because of acceptance, because birth-registered females realizing they're transgendered is a new thing and has, been found to be acceptable and understandable. And then finally, the sharp differences in the numbers identifying as transgender and non-binary and presenting to gender services in Generation Z and younger millennials compared to those over the age of 25-30. It would be expected that older adults would also show some signs of distress regarding their gender, even if they felt unable to come out. Let's unpack that again. How would she know? How would the review know? If someone is in the closet for whatever reason, and I'm sorry for those who are they reporting distress to? If someone's been forced into the closet and are in denial, have a family and a job, and fear that they would be ostracized if they came out at whatever age they are, why on earth would they report anything? Why would they show up on any study, for that matter? I mean, my heart bleeds for them. And, the fact is that, that is how life works, unfortunately. And I wish it didn't. And then I didn't highlight this, but the failure to explain the increase in complex presentations. What's a complex presentation of transgender? Does she mean transgender people who are autistic or non-binary or non-neurotypical? Otherwise, what does that mean? Some people rebut the notion that trans identity may be secondary to mental health problems and instead suggest the mental health problems that are observed are a response to minority stress. Yeah, I think most reliable people would say that. But somehow it's likely to be complex and bidirectional. Again, there's no study saying that. It's just a conclusion they're coming up with. Some individuals preceding mental ill health may result in uncertainty around gender identity. So, if you're depressed or have OCD or eating disorders, you're likely to be transgender as a result. I mean, the sheer grossness of that statement in black and white, paid for, by the way, by the British taxpayer, it's stomach turning. Here again, they're talking about peer influence, and young people who are already feeling different may have that sense exacerbated if they don't fit in with the demonstrations of masculinity and femininity they're exposed to socially and online. Yes, I think the result of that should be to fight against that sort of peer pressure as opposed to making the people who are feeling bullied or ostracized by that or different worse. But that's just me. Peer influence during this stage of life is very powerful, as well as the influence of social media. The review has heard accounts of female students forming intense friendships with other gender questioning or transgender students at school, and then identifying as trans themselves. You know, like you became friends with the person who was smoking pot, and then you were smoking pot all of a sudden. Or you fell in with a bad crowd, and whoops, I'm getting genital reassignment surgery. Sorry, sarcasm is sometimes the only defense I have. Oh, look, there's that word vulnerable again. Puberty is an intense period of rapid change and can be a difficult process where young people are vulnerable to mental health problems, particularly girls. Unwelcome bodily changes and experiences can be uncomfortable, but this can be particularly distressing for young neurodiverse people who may struggle with the sensory changes. Therefore, we should discount their own reporting. There is no single explanation for the increase in prevalence of gender incongruence or the change in case mix of those being referred. Pragmatically, all of the above explanations are likely to be true, are they? To a greater or lesser extent, but for any individual, a different mix of factors will apply. Are they? Are they likely to be true? I mean, a lot of these sort of seem to be pulled out of, let's go with thin air, since it's a family show. There's at least an acknowledgement that in contrast to how people across Britain, I think probably in distributed America, think that it's so easy to get the gender assignment or puberty blockers or so forth. Many young people who are seen felt that the process was too onerous and too invasive. And that because gender incongruence is not considered to be a mental health condition, clinicians are often reluctant to explore or address co-concurring mental health issues in children and young people presenting with gender distress. Look, and I think, again, in a vacuum, I think that should be addressed, right? I think we should be in a position where people who have gender incongruence can get their mental health needs addressed without feeling as if it's being used as an excuse to write off their gender incongruence. But the fear, of course, is that clinicians should not be actively looking for reasons to excuse away how the young person feels. Right? I mean, I think that seems fair, right? What does the CAS review say about this? Well, there are several reasons why listing all relevant formal diagnoses is important for this group of children and young people. In order to consider all possible diagnoses? I mean, yes, and in the case of offering potentially irreversible medical treatments to patients, it is important to specify whether they meet formal diagnostic criteria for medical dysphoria and any other conditions. I mean, I think that's fair to a certain extent. The University of York Systemic Review, again, University of York, which we've already noted is somewhat problematic, demonstrated that other diagnoses were not consistently documented, and in order to better understand and support these children and young people, it is essential that all diagnoses are systemically recorded for clinical and research purposes. If someone is reporting as saying they believe they are transgender, that they are born into the wrong gender, or however they want to describe it, what are the other diagnoses? What are those other diagnoses? They never really quite say, do they? They don't. Spoiler alert. And again, the review does acknowledge that there should be no conversion practice. However, it also maintains that young people and children with gender dysphoria may have a range of complex psychosocial challenges and are mental problems impacting on their gender-related distress. Again, I think in a vacuum, fair. Like, I think people who experience some level of gender dysphoria or what have you may have other mental health issues. That's true of people without gender dysphoria, as it happens. And they should get the treatment they need. And again, this is something that a lot of the transphobes who've taken this report and ran with it have missed. The intent of psychological intervention is not to change the person's perception of who they are, but to work with them to explore their concerns and experiences and help alleviate their distress, regardless of whether they pursue a medical pathway or not. And I think that is a fair statement to an extent, but I would also argue that it is if you take it that you're trying to pursue mental health treatments to alleviate distress, but you're defining distress as including the medical diagnosis of gender distress and trying to alleviate it so that they don't see themselves as trans, that could be problematic. It is concerning that young people may not feel that they could be honest with their health professionals. But again, I think the response to this, and notice that there's no addressing this directly. I think the way to look at that is to say, well, we're not going to use someone's mental health distress to delegitimize their transgender identity. I mean, that's easy to say, right? I don't know why they don't. Based on the review of the notes from people who've gone into British gender clinics, the history journey was rarely examined closely for signs of difficulty, regret, or wishes to alter any aspect of the child, young person's gender journey trajectory. It's unclear if they mean that there just wasn't anything in the notes and therefore they expected there to be more. But again, the percentages tend to be around 1%. More people tend to regret tattoos they've had than going down this quote-unquote gender journey trajectory. And then there is the concern with people who are, quote, living in stealth, which is its own problematic phrase. What they mean by that are people who've socially transitioned but don't inform the people around them that they are were assigned a different gender at birth. And so, again, it's transphobic. Let's just cut to the chase. Calling it stealth implies a trick, implies a falsehood, right? Someone is in stealth mode. They're being feared of being found out, and that is troubling. And their conclusion from this is even more troubling because they say, as a result of being in stealth, quote unquote, in stealth, and being found out, they are more likely to be more desperate and more urgent to access puberty blockers, which may not allow consideration of other pros and cons of the treatment. And I cannot really grapple with how awful that is if you think about it, right? You have a child who believes in their heart that they are born in the wrong gender, and so rather than being called Thomas, they want to be called Thomasina or something. They want to be called her, and they might be quote unquote found out at school and therefore bullied, and therefore they obviously can't seriously want to have the puberty blockers. They must be in distress because of the stealth and not because of feeling like they're born in the wrong body. Again, it's the constant delegitimization, trying to find other explanations for why someone might feel the way they do. Many parents are concerned about not being involved in social transition. Well, let's face it, a lot of that is because children are afraid that their parents are going to do bad things to them if they find out. Some parents felt that social transition was of more benefit to their child in terms of social impact than helping to maintain, to manage their gender incongruence. And look, some, again, is doing a lot of work. We don't have the numbers here. And yet somehow, despite there not being a full research paper on this subject, it's written in here. Mental health outcomes. The only consistent benefit from social transition was for use of chosen name in adolescents, where one study found this was associated with some improvements and in mental health and reduced suicidality for 15 to 21-year-olds. And another study found that there was some improvement in mental health distress for 16 to 24-year-olds. But, some improvement, only benefit. I mean, that's pretty good. Improvement in mental health, reduction in suicidality. Why is that being discounted? Why is the word only being used there? Why is that being discounted? I don't understand. And here's this acknowledgement after going through all of this to say there was also an association between childhood social transition and more intense gender dysphoria, so it may be that the intensity of dysphoria was the factor that led to persistence and the more pressing drive for the children to socially transition. An acknowledgement, finally, that it's not about gender trajectories or what have you, that early social transition is causative of later gender dysphoria. I mean, it's again, they're being pulled to reality by being pulled away from the delegitimization of how children feel. And yet, given the weakness of research, there are many unknowns about the impact of social transition, even though a few paragraphs earlier, they were just saying there was an improvement in mental health by at least using someone's chosen name. In particular, it's unclear whether it alters the trajectory of gender development. And so what? There's no clear evidence that social transition in childhood has positive or negative mental health outcomes. Again, a few paragraphs before, they actually said there was. It's possible that social transition in childhood may change the trajectory of gender identity developments for children with early gender incongruence. For this reason, a more cautious approach needs to be taken for children than for adolescents. Change the trajectory of gender identity development. Again, why is that a bad thing? And I don't think there's any explanation for why that's a bad thing that doesn't wind up being transphobic. One of the recommendations is for parents to get clinical help before helping someone, allowing their children to do social transitions. That children should be sat down and explain what the risks and benefits of social transition as a planned thing, referencing the best available evidence. And it's important to ensure that the voice of the child is heard in any decision making. Again, something that gets included in here is, and I think is a positive thing, but gets skipped over by almost everyone who is trying to use this to say that terrible things have been happening to children. Note that in their study of things happening in Britain, they only found fewer than 10 patients detransitioning back to their gender. It's not a lot. And I think this is part of where the review gives its game away. When they talk about puberty blockers, adolescence being a time of overall identity development, sexual fluidity, and experimentation for many people. Yes, not everyone. Blocking this experience means that young people have to understand their identity and sexuality based only on their discomfort about puberty and a sense of their gender identity developed in an early stage of the pubertal process. I mean, that's the point, but sure. And then you get to the second sentence. Therefore, there is no way of knowing whether the normal trajectory of the sexual and gender identity may be permanently altered. The normal trajectory. The normal trajectory. Not the child's extant trajectory, not the child's otherwise trajectory. The normal trajectory may be permanently altered by using puberty blockers. Again, it's this continued reference to normality. That the implication and the assumption that remaining the gender you are assigned at birth is the normal process. If this is the case, brain maturation may be temporarily or permanently disrupted by the use of puberty blockers, which could have a significant impact on the young person's ability to make complex, risk-laden decisions, as well as having possible longer-term neuropsychological consequences. And again, this is based on a concern that adolescent sex hormone surges may trigger the opening of a critical period for experience-dependent rewiring of neural circuits. That's unclear. There's no study that seems to suggest that. No study cited here. And as more recent brain studies have shown, as I've mentioned, Brain maturation continues. Till the day we die, our brain is maturing. So, again, what they seem to be saying is that there is a normal way for the brain to mature that puberty blockers disrupt, and that is a bad thing. They found no evidence that puberty blockers improve body image or dysphoria, and very limited evidence for positive mental health outcomes, and without a control group. Could be due to placebo effect or concomitant psychological support. So, in the absence of a placebo group for these things, we are going to reject any study that seems to suggest that there is a positive mental health outcome. Again, how do you do a control test on puberty blockers? Ethically, you can't. You cannot do one ethically. And again, like, I don't have a particular background in pediatric medicine or endocrinology. I'm really taking the text for what it is. And yet it's internally inconsistent throughout. Like before, social transition, just by using the right name, can lead to improved mental health, but we have to be careful about social transition because it may change their trajectory into something we don't like. And here, systemic review found little or no evidence that there was any improvement. And, even if there are, we can discount it because it wasn't done with a control group, which is impossible to do. Again, even on its own terms, it makes no sense. It is not unexpected that blocking surges of hormonal surges may dampen distress and improve psychological functions in the short term in some young people, some doing a lot of work. But this may not be an appropriate response to pubertal discomfort. Why not? Again, it's an assumption that the way things have always been done is the right way for things to be done. Oh, look, but there was moderate quality evidence from mainly pre-post studies that hormone treatment may improve psychological health in the short term. So hormone treatments may be helpful, but there were inconsistencies regarding suicidality and or self-harm, with 3 showing an improvement and 1 no change. Is that an inconsistency? Or if you take all those together, what would that suggest to you? What do I know? However, they find a way to delegitimize that, right? The start of long anticipated physical changes could be expected to improve mood, at least in the short term, and it is perhaps surprising that there is not a greater effect size. So the effect that they're discounting because they're not big enough. Yet, again, something that gets missed. Regardless of causality, the focus should be on treating all the young person's needs rather than expecting the hormone treatment alone will address long-standing mental ill health. And I think people would agree with that. Anyone who cares about transgender people would agree with that. And there's no one solution to everything. Regardless of the numbers who detransition, and again, there aren't that many. They couldn't find that many. However, they did at some point find a self-identified sample of 100 detransitioners. Now let's take a step back again. The review has rejected studies that have shown a level of improvement for people who have taken puberty blockers, for people who have been on hormone treatments, for people who have socially transitioned because they're low quality. And we're going to spend a huge paragraph digging into why people detransition based on a self-identified sample who completed an anonymous online questionnaire. If the York group was actually reviewing this, what grade do you think they would give an anonymous online questionnaire? High quality? Low quality? I don't know. I'm pretty sure it's low, but what do I know? But thank goodness they don't do a chart or anything. Oh, look, a huge chart about self-reported reasons for detransitioning, where they misspelled dysphoria. Transition did not help with my dysphoria. I found alternatives to deal with my dysphoria. Dysphoria has a Y. But again, it's what you get when you spend millions of pounds of taxpayer money on a review and a report. You get misspellings in your charts that don't really have a scientific basis but you're underlining them by putting them in this handy chart to show. Yeah, I don't know what to tell you, folks. I just don't know what to tell you. And again, young people who commence on hormones, many report a period of gender euphoria. This makes it surprising that the observed improvements in psychological functioning in the first year of masculining, feminizing hormones are relatively modest. So when you do find gains, they discount them because they're not big enough again. And then again, coming back to this normalcy preference, in the absence of any experience as an adult cis woman, they may have no frame of reference to cause them to regret or detransition, but at the same time, they may have had a different outcome without medical intervention and would not have needed to take lifelong hormones. Again, so what? And if a young person is already on puberty blockers, they will need to make the decision to consent to masculining, feminizing hormones at a point when their psychosexual development has been paused and possibly with little experience of their biological puberty. That's the point. That is the point. That is the point of having puberty blockers, is to not have experience of biological puberty. There's a preference here again, a normalcy bias for psychosexual development being normal and preferable with no factual support for that. It's a bias without support. And we close with another although younger people experience a sense of urgency to access medical treatment, some young adults have suggested that taking time to explore options is preferable. Again, it's unclear who some is, how many we're talking about. Some and suggested, always doing so much work, the weasel words throughout. So why is this important? Why do people outside of Britain care? Why do cisgender people like me, why should we care? And it's because of some of the things we talked about during this discussion. Dr. Cass was working with the DeSantis campaign in Florida, or the DeSantis administration in Florida. The move against trans rights is happening everywhere around the world, and it's part of a movement against any kind of gender rights. There have been conferences in the last 5-10 years, usually called, Focus on the Family, or Children and Family Conference, celebrating the family. There was one recently that Judith Butler talks about in Budapest, Hungary, where the fascist Viktor Orban spoke and greeted them, where you had representatives from the Vatican, evangelicals, authoritarians, getting together to try to, quote, defend the family against the abuse that is gay marriage, that is abortion rights, that is women's equality, that is gender nonconformity. And I don't want to say there's conspiracy, because I don't think it's that intricate, involved, or anything like that. I think these are organizations and groups that are just all pulling in the same direction, making common cause on this one issue. But they're all leveraging that issue. They're all leveraging different aspects of these things in order to gain power, in order to gain more control over people, to use the dogma of protecting children to leverage that into other forms of control. There's no mistake in that the main reaction to this review was to see that as a result, NHS and the gender clinics were abusing children by doing these puberty blockers, by doing hormonal treatments, by allowing children to socially transition. People are leveraging that for power. People are leveraging that to minimize the work that organizations are doing, by claiming that they're child abusers. And the purpose for all of that is to delegitimize the whole push for individual rights. The transgender struggle is everyone's struggle, because it's about giving people the right to make the determinations for themselves. It's the pro-choice fight. It is the equality fight. They're all bound together. And in sort of going through this, I wanted to point out the inherent problems with this argument, that it just doesn't hold water. And what is happening is, as many people have pointed out, in terms of what is also happening here, is by waving the flag of protecting the children, you are able to short circuit any contrary arguments. How dare you want to hurt children? How dare you speak up in favor of these child abusers, so to speak? How dare you question us who are only trying to protect women and children or the family? And it silences dissent. And it silences those who would say, wait a second, what is the outcome of this? What's the outcome of this? Because of the Cass Review in Britain, they are no longer providing puberty blockers. They are no longer providing hormonal treatments for people who have been already approved for the treatments, which means that you are forcing people to detransition right now in Britain. Wales and Scotland have followed suit. I didn't show you, but there are many places in that report where they talk about evidence-based reviews, even though, as I've shown, very little of it is evidence-based. And yet it's been taken with sheer credulity by too many people, partially because of that short circuit of protecting children. And I hope if you've followed me this far into this story and learning about this and talking about this, you can be wary of when people wave the flag to protect children without thinking through what it is they're actually asking you to do. It's the same argument for why there's a crackdown on pornography, why there's a crackdown on no-fault divorces, for that matter. And it's always ironic when the Catholic Church comes out to protect children, since they've failed on that miserably over the last 200, 300 years, let alone the sheer number of evangelicals who have turned out to be, pedophiles and whatnot. Still no drag queens have been found to be pedophiles, but certainly a lot of youth ministers and evangelical pastors. But this is particularly troubling because it's being picked up and ran with to hurt people and to diminish their rights. And I hope that we on the left can together try and stop that. And I hope you will join me in letting people know about these sort of issues. Feel free to share this video, and thank you so much for listening. I hope we'll talk again on happier subjects. I'm hoping to do interviews and more discussions and more dissections of things to try to explain what is really going on and how arguments aren't making sense or hold water, not just to sort of make us feel better, but to hopefully have the tools we need to fight back against those things. Thank you just so much for being part of this and listening for this far. And I've been John O'Connor, and this has been Keep Left. Please keep left.